Wonderful. Right, just to say as well, there's no Sisterhood next week. I know Kath will mention that again, but just in case some of you have to slip out. We don't have it next week because it's the AOG conference, and quite a few of us are going down to that. Callum Shinney will be graduating next Friday, which is going to be great. So Callum and Sarah will be there. So there'll be a lot of us here. So it isn't on, but you are more than welcome to come to the coffee bar and have coffee and meet up next week, which will be great. But there'll be no Sisterhood next week, but there will be right up until the end of term, school term. Right, the parable, the rich fool. For some reason, I wrote it, I was thinking it was a rich young fool, but when I read it, I thought, no, he's middle-aged or he's getting on in life. He's not young. He was called the rich fool. And remember I said to you, a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And in our society, we have lots and lots of stories or parables. And the stories we have are like traditional tales. So I've written down a few more here. The story of the tortoise and this hare. And the moral of the story is slow and steady wins the race. Life is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So that was the moral of that story. Another story you might have grown up with was Cinderella. And the meaning of that is don't let your circumstances squash you of the dreams you have within you. So it doesn't matter your circumstances. And these were stories that would be told. Another one, Beauty and the Beast. Value internal qualities like kindness and don't judge people on outward appearances. And another one I thought of was the boy who cried wolf. And you know about telling tales and telling us. I've told this story many times at school, explaining to the children, that you need to be telling the truth because then people won't believe you. So these are all moral stories that are in our culture, and in your own culture there's probably lots of stories that you would know. And so Jesus is talking in the New Testament, and he's talking to people who have a history of stories being handed down, and they understand stories really well. And so the story is in Luke 12, but it's always really important to look at what happens before this parable is spoken. So Jesus is sitting there. It says he's got a massive crowd. So thousands of people are there listening, and they're hanging on his every word, and he's talking to them. And this is what precedes the story. He's talking to them about hypocrisy, about, don't say one thing and do another thing. Don't live this life, or don't live so pious and actually a Sunday Christian, and then Monday to Saturday, you live a different life. So he's speaking against that. And then he's speaking about, if you get physically attacked, don't worry if you get physically attacked, because actually they may damage the outside, but God sees the inside, and your inside won't be damaged. Then he speaks about, he speaks to them about how important your eternal destiny is, And then he's talking about how valuable you are. He's talking to these thousands. He goes, do you know how valuable you are? Do you understand how much God loves you? Do you understand how much he cares for you? He actually, after the parable, he actually comes back to this thought and speaks about the birds and the flowers of the trees and says, are you not more valuable than them? Then he also says, he's talking to them because you need to take a stand. You need to stand strong. Let your light shine. He's talking this and he's doing really, really good. And then someone shouts out and disrupts the message. Verse 13 to 15. Then someone called out from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Friend, who made me judge over you to decide such things as this?" Then he said, "Be aware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." For many, many years, when I would teach either in Sunday school here or with little groups of kids or in schools and that, there was lots of interruptions. Usually it was, "Can I go to the toilet?" But children interrupt you and they will put their hand up. You'll say any question and they will come out with the most bizarre, random thing, especially little children. And you're like, oh, and everyone then talks about that and you're like, okay, right, boys and girls, let me tell you a story. And I would bring them all back. I would tell them a story, regroup, and that's what Jesus does. So he's in this great sermon. Somebody interrupts him and he's thinking, oh, hang on a second. I was in a good flow there. And this has happened. This guy has interrupted me. But he doesn't allow the distraction to ruin him. Because he says, be aware of every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how you own. And then he starts telling the story. You see, what he's saying in the moral of this parable that he's about to say is, the heart of the issue is the issue of the heart. this brother was like, please tell my brother to split the inheritance, blah, blah, blah. And he's saying all this kind of stuff. And he's saying, and Ian, Jesus, there we go. There's a slip of the tongue. And Jesus is then saying, no, it's not about how much you have or having it all divided. What it's about is it's your attitude, and it's your attitude there. Jesus had been teaching to the crowd about what it looks like to be a Christ follower, and he decides, okay, I've been disrupted. Everyone's now thinking about this. They're now probably thinking about their inheritance. And he doesn't, this is the few things he does, and this is what we have to do when we get distracted and people want to side rail us. Jesus doesn't answer the man's request. He refuses to get sidetracked because he's been here to redeem humanity, not to get involved he's not Judge Judy. He's not going to get involved in something like that. Jesus looks through the man and he sees that the real issue, the deeper thing, is greed and coveting. And he uses this interruption to address something, which is the heart of the issue. The heart of this issue is the issue of the heart. That's what the real thing is. So I'm going to just read the parable, and then I've got 3 simple points. Then Jesus gathered and said, okay, let me tell you a story here. A rich man had a fertile farm and produced fine crops. He said to himself, what shall I do? I don't have any room for all my crops. Then he said to himself, I know, I'll tear down my barns. I'll build bigger barns. Then I'll have room to store all my wheat and all my other goods. And I will sit back and I will say to myself, friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, you are going to die tonight. Then who is going to get everything you own? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God. And that was the thing he was wanting to say to him. So in that story, he's now taken everybody's back, and then he continues on. And he continues on after verse 21. He then continues on and starts speaking about what the real value is. So 3 simple points here. First one, gold above God. Gold above God. Have you ever seen a hearse driving to, you've probably all seen a hearse driving to either a cremation or to a funeral parlor. And have you ever seen a trailer being pulled behind it with all their earthly goods? I don't think you have. Because we can't take anything with us. You literally are the same. I remember seeing a picture of a grave. It was a hole in the ground, 2 holes in the ground, and they said, rich man's grave, poor man's grave. We go into the same size, So it says in Proverbs 27:24, riches do not endure, and a crown is not secure for all generations. We can put our security in who we are and value in things like that, but it is not secure for generations. There were many, many kings and kingdoms within our world that are now not monarchies anymore because the security was not in there. People rose up and decided they didn't want a monarchy anymore. It's interesting. When you read this story, you can read it and think, goodness me, this man was wise. And he was wise because it's good to be responsible. It's good to save. It's really important to budget. You know the story about Joseph, and God gave him wisdom to start budgeting because famine is coming, so start budgeting. So it's good to be like that. It's good to manage your resources well, but there's always a but. Saving will not bring you total joy. Hoarding and keeping all of this will not bring you total joy. The Bible is full of references about money and wealth and stories, but the Bible is not against money. It's against the love of money. It says in 1 Timothy 6, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's not that money is evil, but it's the love of it. It's where you place money and value in your world that makes it the root of all kinds of evil. And there's a friend of mine, I was speaking to him not long ago, and he was giving this illustration. He said that he was in a room, he was in this, he'd been invited to exclusive exclusive lounge, in one of these big football places in, I don't know, it was Manchester City or Liverpool or somewhere like that. And he was invited to this exclusive place because his friend was a billionaire. And so he said he was in this room with about 7 or 8 billionaires. And he said, and I'm there as a local pastor in the city. And he says, I'm there and I'm listening to the conversation. And he says, the conversation, they were talking about their yachts and this and the other. Somebody came in with a thing and said, would anybody like to place a bet? And they were like, yes, I'll place a bet, 100,000 on this person scoring the first goal. And he's like, this world exists and I know nothing about this world. And he listened, and then at the very end he said, so what about your families? And there was this deathly silence. And then they started speaking. And the sadness in the room was palpable. Money doesn't bring you satisfaction. Money doesn't bring you everything. These men they were all billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires. But they didn't have the joy that they had. They weren't experiencing the joy from their wealth because they'd got the priorities wrong. The Bible speaks about being foolish. It says a fool is a lazy person, a sloppy person, it squanders everything. We think of the prodigal son, and all the Proverbs is full of being wise and foolish. And then a wise person is hardworking and grafting and careful planning. But it's interesting that these two words come together. Rich, which you think he must be wise, but fool. And they almost clash. They almost don't go together well. But if you get to eternity and you have lost everything, you can't take everything with you. If you end up in eternity with nothing, then you've made wrong decisions. And that's what he's trying to say. Matthew 16:26 says, what will you benefit if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? This man was rich and admired in society. He was a shrewd businessman. He was middle-aged or perhaps getting onto the thing where he was going to start retiring. He was a very hard worker. He was very successful in everyone's eyes, in the eyes probably of God and in the eyes of man. He was a really great business person. He had used his talents well. He had saved money. He wasn't spendthrift. He was wise. He used everything that God had given him. But when you dig into the story, it's all about him. Let me read this, and I'm going to emphasize all the personal pronouns, okay? He said to himself, what shall I do? I don't have room for all my crops. Then he said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger barns. Then I'll have enough room to store all my wheat and all my other goods. You see, in those two verses, he has used the word I, me, so many times. It's all about him. He forgot to acknowledge that God provided the rain for the crops, that God provided the field for him. He forgot to acknowledge that anything in this that he did was about God. He thought it was all about him. He was a self-made millionaire, okay? He did it all himself. I did it my way. So he forgot to acknowledge God. His goal was above God. He never asked God for advice. He said, I will do this and I will do that. He speaks to himself. He's not even talking to anyone else. He has a conversation with himself and is, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, self, I think that's a good idea. He has a conversation with himself, and him and himself and I decide this is a good plan. He doesn't consult the Lord for anything because he doesn't know the Lord. He doesn't take any advice for any decisions. I think all his life he has made the decisions for himself. Perhaps he had no time to build a relationship with God. He was too busy building his earthly empire. There's a great story, and I got this story. It's a really good story. It is from the Daily Bread. So if any of you read the Daily Bread, there's a wonderful little story there. And this was taken from the Daily Bread. I think it was in 1992, this little illustration. So this is a story about a man called George Truett. And Pastor George Truett lived in Texas, and one day one of his congregations said, "Oh, Pastor Truett, come round to my house. I would like to invite you for dinner." So Pastor Truett goes round, and they had this amazing dinner, and then afterwards he said, "Come with me, let's go and find a nice vantage point." So they found this vantage point, and he said, "Let's look north." So they looked north, and he said, "You see all those oil wells there?" And Pastor said, "Yes." He said, "They're mine." Then they looked, 25 years ago, he said, there was nothing there, but now there's oil wells. They're all mine. Then he said, "Let's look south." And he said, "You see all those fields of grain and produce? That's mine as well." And then he turned east and he said, "You see all those fields in front of you full of all the cattle and the longhorn cattle from Texas that they're very famous for? It's all mine." And then he looked west, and he saw a beautiful forest. There was just a beautiful forest and landscape, and he said, "That's mine as well." And the pastor was like, "Wow, that's amazing." He's probably thinking, "Goodness me, we're going to do well in church. He's got a good tithe coming our way." And the Pastor Truett said, "That was amazing. That was wonderful. Thank you for the tour and all this." And then he put his arm around him and goes, "Well, what's up there?" And he pointed over, "Have you put anything up there?" And the man said, "Pastor, I've never thought of that." And it was so interesting, such a simple illustration. We can be so busy building things that we forget to build what's really important. He was a fool because all of his riches were temporary, and he'd neglected God and eternity. What are we storing up in heaven? Sometimes it's so interesting because some of us, we think to ourselves, "Oh, yes, I'll give my tithe." We think, "Oh, good, I've ticked that box. 90% is mine." No, actually, God owns 100% of your money. You're not going to just have to give account for the 10% you give. What did you do with the other 90%? Did you share it easily? Did you give freely? Did you loan freely? Not loan as in I want the money back. Did you lend and give to people freely? What did you do with the 100%, not just the 10%? And sometimes I've heard people going, "Oh, I can't believe that conference. It's so expensive. Imagine a Christian conference. It's costing £25. I mean, what do they call?" We think nothing about paying for a package holiday and upgrading ourselves in a cruise ship or things like that. We need to check our hearts. So this parable, Jesus was talking to the crowds, and he was wanting them to check their hearts. So I'm just saying to you, I've been challenged and thought to myself, what am I doing with my 100%, not just the 10%, okay? So let's do that. So as well as checking that gold isn't above God, the second point is production above people. The produce, what are we gaining in life? Production above people. So when he had all he could ever want, he never considered these few things. He never considered, like he was bursting at the seams, could he have considered giving some to the poor? Because the poor were all around him. He could have thought, "You know what? I have been blessed so much. Let me give it away." He didn't think about sharing his wealth. He just thought about hoarding it. He didn't think about giving up his time and thinking, "I've done this. I'm now going to give my time and sow into other ministries and do other things and to help the poor farmers that are struggling." Success isn't all about money. It says in the Bible that Joseph was so successful and God blessed him above and beyond, in whatever he did when he was in Potiphar's house. But he was a slave. So position didn't make him successful. It was how he dealt with what God gave him. And how we can become rich towards others is to have joy in our lives. And how we get joy is when we get our priorities right, when you have Jesus first. And then you get that right, and then you're like, okay, let me think of others. How can I bless others? And then what's left over for myself? But this guy had it all upside down. It was all about him, and he had no room for anyone else, and he certainly didn't have room for God. Proverbs 28:27 says, "You shall never, never, never go without if you give to the poor. But if you are heartless and stingy and selfish, you invite curses upon yourself." I love that translation. I've seen it in different ones, but I love that one. I don't want to bring curses upon myself. In biblical times, the Jews, when Jesus was telling the story, they would have been like, oh yeah, we understand not just about tithing, we understand about offerings, because they were instructed, don't pick up all the stuff from the fields, leave some for the poor people. I believe this man probably didn't leave any even for the poor and the widows. I think he gleaned everything. We always think we can do this, we've ticked that box and everything is ours, but it's not ours. We become rich towards God when and when we involve him in investing our wealth in compassion towards other people and people less fortunate. This is what I wrote down, a few things. This is what it looks like in 2024. Serving on a mission trip. I'm going to go on a mission trip. Yes, it's a sacrifice. Yes, I have to pay my way there, but we're going to go on a mission trip. I remember many, many years ago, we were going to do a mission trip. You wouldn't even know these people. It was, 20 years ago in church. And they were like, we need to do some fundraising. We need to raise some money and so that my funds will be met. And Ian was like, no, that's part of the sacrifice of serving. And they didn't understand that whole thing. So serving on a mission trip, that's what it looks like, giving to other people. Getting a bag of groceries and coming to the food bank. I was really convicted with this. I can't remember where we were. I was watching a thing. We must have been at a conference or something, and I can't remember, but I was watching this thing about these poor women that were, it must have been somewhere in Africa, or I can't even remember what country it was, but every time they cooked a meal, they took a handful of grain. I can't remember the story, some of you will remember, and they put it into a bag. And so then these are poor people living in squalor. Every time they put another one there. And when the bag was full, they would bring it. So the poor were helping the poor. And God blessed their industry above and beyond. When I heard that, I felt so convicted. I thought, God, every week I come to church, could I not just take a tin of beans from my cupboard and bless somebody with that? Could I not take something with me and bless someone? And I just thought to myself, oh my word, let me do this. So I've tried to do that. So since New Year, I thought, right, every week I get a bag of groceries. And so what I've been doing is, I go and buy a whole bunch and I divide them into 3 bags. So I've always got a bag on the go that I can pop things into. And it's nothing. I don't even miss it. But that's what it can look like. Just something really small. Taking a meal to someone. Do you know how much that has blessed someone? There's a little boy who's in Champions at the moment, and his dad doesn't know Jesus, but he's been seriously ill in hospital. And so as a church, we were like, yeah, we'll take the meals. I popped around with the meal yesterday, and he said, can you please get Ian to announce in church, this has been the most unbelievable blessing. I've never experienced kindness. No one has ever given me anything. This is unbelievable. He's just blown away by kindness. It doesn't take a lot. It just takes an effort on our part, Paying for someone to go to camp. I haven't had children going to camp for many years, but I always will go and say, is there someone that needs some money to go to camp? See if you can bless someone. You don't know what you're seeding. That child that you might pay to go to camp. I bet somebody paid for Leanne to go to camp when she was young. And they have no idea the ministry that she's now involved in, and they're part of that because they invested their money and sent her off to camp. You see, we can do all sorts of things. Taking on a compassion child, serving in a ministry like Bethany or Food Bank, it's how you give your life away. I know of someone who is actually a very, very wealthy person, and only when I've got to know her and I've started speaking to her and started finding out about things, and she's very reluctant to speak, but it's only through other ministries that she has blessed above and beyond. You wouldn't believe it. Bankrolled huge things in Alpha, huge things in Care for the Family, huge things in, she's bankrolled so many different things. And she doesn't want anyone to know. But there's a God in heaven that sees everything she does. And he blesses her more because he can trust her with wealth. So when you give, and God sees you give with a generous, open hand, he blesses you above and beyond. So you should try it sometime. I remember just before my dad died, he realized he was going to die. It was in the last couple of weeks of his death. And he wrote a letter to the Bible Society because he had always given. He was a very, very generous person. And he looked at all the finances. He made sure Mom was going to be well taken care of. He spoke to me about the finances. And then he sent off this huge check to the Building Society. And we got this check back saying, oh, this is incredible, it would need to be gift dated. And Dad just had hours to live. And I says, Dad, and we managed to get him to sign the gift aid form because he always believed in gift aid. And in the 14 years since he's died, I still get people coming up to me and telling me stories of the blessing and the quiet things he did when no one else knew about it. There's even people in this room I know that Dad blessed and gave. And I've only found out, but there's been a record in heaven. There's been, oh, it's him again. Get out, open up his file. Let's just type it in. Let's type it in. There's a file for each of us up there. What's our files look like? Are they pretty empty? Or are they getting full? So that's all I would say, those things. So don't worry about production above people. Always think about people first. God will produce more and give you thing. The third thing, earthly planning above eternal investment. He only thought of the earth. He only thought of the present. Last week we were looking at the wise and foolish bridesmaids, and they were just, the foolish ones just looked for today. They weren't walking in the possibility or in anticipation that God could do something else with them. And the parables are quite similar because he's saying there is no guarantee. Jesus says no guarantee for tomorrow. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, but we know who holds our hand. And so we know nothing about tomorrow. And he's assuming that he's got a long life to live. He's got lots of things. He's just going to have a really good retirement. But the Lord says, he's gone today, and he's done nothing for heaven. And, I just wanted to say, just in closing here, one of the largest industries that's been growing in our country is storage. Even looking out there, it says storage den. So up and down the country, there are building places for people to store their stuff. They have too much stuff. It's a big problem when people downsize, because when they downsize, they're like, what are we going to do with our stuff? We can't part with it. And sometimes I've heard of people that are like, well, we'll just put it in the loft where we are. Or we'll put it in a storage bin, or we'll do things. And people store stuff. I remember many years ago, we were going to be getting a new kitchen, and so I was so excited about this new kitchen. I packed away half my kitchen. Thought, well, I have to get rid of some of this stuff. So I packed a lot of the stuff away and thought, I don't really need this. I put it away and I started decanting the stuff into boxes in the garage. And then it worked out that it was going to be too expensive to do the kitchen. I thought, I'm not going to bring that stuff back. So I just left it in the garage. And then about a year and a half later, we did do the new kitchen. And I forgot about the stuff in the garage. I didn't really need it, did I? I actually got rid of it because it was surplus. And then my intention was to bring it back with my brand new kitchen. Then I took it back. I thought, I've lived without this. I don't need it. And so think of iCloud storage. You need to upgrade to iCloud storage. You need to buy some more storage. Who needs 10,000 pictures? We don't. But we can't get rid of them. We're scared to. Before we were really happy with a little album. I went to visit my aunt in Northern Ireland. She took out 2 albums, and it's her life story. And I went through all the albums. That's it all in there, 2 little albums. We have thousands and thousands of pictures. We're buying storage to store all our pictures. Storage bins and storage places and the big yellow storage, they're up and down the country for people to store their wealth. There's even TV programs in America where people have forgotten that they bought that they stored stuff in these garages. And so they find these garages and they then auction them off, and they'll bid these garages off and they'll open them up. And then sometimes you see the stuff is absolutely rubbish. You think, why did people store this stuff? It's broken. They had intentions of going back. But we're like that sometimes. We need to declutter our lives. Imagine, I was thinking, I saw this really interesting fact. In 1870 in America, there was 13,000 companies for horses and buggies, And there was 13 companies. They were doing an amazing thing. They were building up a huge industry. They were the wealthiest people, and they were doing amazing. And they kind of turned sideways and noticed the motor car and thought, well, that's not going to take off. You see, we can build up an empire here that actually becomes obsolete. We can put our effort into things that actually will just disappear. I remember in 1984, just before I I remember teaching in Kemnay, and everybody was getting a BBC computer to the school. And this thing arrived, and we all looked and thought, well, that certainly won't take off. What a waste of time. It's taken up space. It'll never be used. And now we can't exist without them, So, and all the things that were important that supported that system are all obsolete, and we're onto something new, So let's be careful not to be like the rich fool, So imagine, I was thinking about Steve Jobs, the man who invented the iPhone and all that stuff, multi-million billionaire, whatever, died at the age of 56. All the wealth in the world could not cure his pancreatic cancer. So sad. And I don't know where he was. God knows. I remember seeing something. I remember many years ago hearing a little sermon on, there was the iPhone and there was the iWatch and there was something else, and it was like, I died. And it was a thing about Steve Jobs, all these wonderful inventions, and one day he had to die. And he died very early. And you just think, well, what did he store up in heaven? I hope he stored up plenty. So 5 warnings that we must avoid. 1, he didn't give God any credit. For anything in his life, he didn't give God any credit. These are 5 foolish things that we mustn't fall into the trap of. We must give God credit. Second thing, he forgot to consult the architect. When you're building, he forgot to consult God. God is the architect of our lives. He didn't consult him for his plans or anything. Imagine building a house and forgetting to consult the architect. Have you ever seen these grand designs programs, and they're like, yeah, we'll just move this, and they get into all sorts of bother because they forget to consult the person, and then they get themselves into bother. And we need to consult the Lord all the time. He is the architect of our lives. We must not get confused with ownership and stewardship. Ownership and stewardship. We don't own what we have. We're called to steward it. Even our children, our children are given to us to lead, to guide, to nurture, but they're his children. They're his children, and we are called to steward them wisely, but ultimately, God owns them. We are fools when we put our treasure in the wrong places. And we are fools when we forget what God says about being contented. True godliness with contentment is great gain. Or another translation, to merely have our necessities is enough. Is enough. And to learn that contentment is a great thing. Thinking about the rich fool and all the different things he had made, I was reminded of a personal story. My son-in-law Tucker, and he had come across here. He'd scoured out the land, and he had noticed Julia, and him and Julia had started, and then he went back to America, and he thought, yes, I'm coming back to spend a year here in the master's program. So he went back there, and he was so excited, and they'd started this, talking back and forth on FaceTime and all this kind of stuff. And Julia was counting down the days until he arrived in Manchester, and he was going to fly up to Aberdeen. So she was really excited and all this. This is way back in 2012. And so everything's going well. And so Tucker's making his plans. He's coming to his new country. It's like we're making plans. Someday we're going to meet our new eternal home. So he has booked the flights. He's had his farewells. There's been farewell services. There's been farewell gifts. He's packed his suitcase. He's got the currency to come here. He's got a credit card, all this kind of stuff. He did everything. And he got the wrong visa. And he arrived, and they're like, what are you here for? He goes, oh, yeah. And he came on a tourist visa, I think. But the other visa wasn't ready enough. He had applied for a student visa for a year's exchange, but it hadn't come, but he just wanted to come here. So he came, and he went against advice, and he just came. And, of course, they pulled him aside and said, what are you here for? He goes, oh, I'm here to study for a year and all this kind of stuff. No, you're not. And I think he even flew first class because his dad was a pilot. So he even flew first class on the plane across here, and he had to do the walk of shame. He didn't even get out of border control. He was put on the next plane back to America because he had the wrong visa, and a mark was put on his passport so that every time, until he became a British citizen, every time he came up, they would pull him aside to have a conversation with him. You see, he had done everything that he was going to do to get to heaven. He had built up everything, he had done everything. But the visa that was going to allow him residence in his new country was missing. And let's be careful. You know, we can do all sorts of things, but we need to make sure we have our visa for heaven, our ticket to heaven, and our treasure. And what's he going to judge us on? He's going to say, well done, you good and faithful servant. And with that, we get to enter what he's got for us.